Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Amy Mapara, and I'm a board member of the Women's History Project, and I'm super pleased to be hosting today's conversation. This is the second session of From Resistance to Redesign, Women Transforming Work. Today's session is Voices Rising, Activism in the Modern Workplace. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, also known as Ottawa. And as a first-generation Canadian whose family sought refuge on this unceded land, I carry deep gratitude to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, whose land offered my family safety, hope, and a chance to begin anew. I'd love for us to take a moment to ground ourselves in who's in the room. Please share in the chat where you're calling from and a bit about yourself. The Women's History Project is working towards a future where gender equality is not aspirational, but fully lived. A future where women's stories, both past and present, are recognized, amplified, and woven into Canada's collective consciousness. Our goal is simple but ambitious, that the next generation of women sees themselves reflected in the stories we tell about our history. We're a nonprofit organization focused on public education through events like this one, as well as through the development of women's history productions. This three-part webinar series is really about naming and confronting the barriers women have faced in the labor force. Together, we are exploring the past, the present, and the future of women's work in Canada through the voices of those who have studied it, lived it, and actively worked to change it. Today, we are focusing on gender inequality in the modern workplace. We'll be asking some important and frankly necessary questions. How are we addressing sexual harassment in the workplace today? Who is still left behind? What are activists, labor leaders, and researchers doing to push for change? What does it really take to shift power dynamics? And is pay equity achievable? This session will dig into present inequities across industries, the reality of unpaid work, the impact of the care economy on women's labor, and the barriers faced by women with diverse identities. A quick note that this event is being recorded and will be shared in a couple of weeks. Before we move forward, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our guests for being here today. And thank you to all of you for joining us and being part of this conversation. I also want to recognize the Women's History Project board members and sponsors and our partners with a special shout out to the English Catholic Teachers Association. A few quick notes on how we'll run today's session. Please feel free to share comments in the chat and to ask questions there as well. After the panelists have shared their remarks, we will have dedicated time for moderated questions. Questions from the chat will be gathered and shared with our panelists, and will support that conversation as it unfolds. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bilan, who will offer some opening remarks before introducing our panelists. Bilan is an award-winning activist and organizer with over 15 years of experience in campaigns, leadership, and movement building. She holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Ottawa, and she is the national representative for human rights at the Canadian Labour Congress. Bilan is a Black Muslim feminist who lives and works in the unceded and never surrendered traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. In all aspects of her work, Bilan is fueled by her passion for social justice and equity. Bilan, I hand the virtual floor over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much, Amy, for that introduction and for setting the context for today's excellent discussion. So, hello, my name is Bilan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a human rights representative with the Canadian Labour Congress. I am really excited to be joined by a very dynamic crew of panelists today. But before we dive into that, I want to tell you a little bit more about our organization and some of the work that we do in this area. So the Canadian Labour Congress, for folks who are not familiar, is Canada's largest and oldest national labour body. And we are made up of over 50 different national and regional unions and labor organizations that stretch from coast to coast to coast. Represent over 3 million unionized workers, as well as important part of our mandate is also representing and advocating on behalf of workers who are not unionized. And so our advocacy agenda on propelling issues such as advancing gender equity and gender justice in the workplace is not isolated only to unionized workplaces, but rather is a commitment to advocacy, lobbying, and organizing for all workers and for fairer workplaces for everyone and fairer communities and more welcoming communities for all people. So as a human rights representative, we do a lot of work in our department around issues that advance women's issues, as well as gender justice and what that looks like in the workplace and in our communities. And I want to highlight a couple of examples to help kick off a bit of this discussion. And you're going to hear much more in-depth conversation around this from some of our esteemed panelists. But in terms of where we're at today, we're still unfortunately facing a fairly persistent wage gap. And Amy kind of alluded to this question of, how are we still fighting this? And is this even achievable? I know we have at least one of our panelists who's going to be addressing that in more detail, but I do want to mention that organizing for pay equity has been a really big part of the labor movement's work and role in our country, as well as a big part of our advocacy agenda globally. And so in Canada, we, of course, celebrated the introduction of pay equity legislation a few years ago. However, the issue continues to persist. And I think what it highlights is that it's not just about the sort of legislative changes that, of course, we want to continue to advocate on, but that there's also an important role for labor movements and for progressive movements in general to be advocating for culture change. That we need to recognize that part of what makes pay equity issues persistent in our workplaces, in our communities, despite the fact that we've made some pretty great gains legislatively in that regard, is that there's still a culture that devalues this idea of what women's work is and feminized labor. And so there's such a huge role, I think, for the labor movement to be playing, to actively run campaigns and education programs to be able to dispel some of these myths about feminized labor and about women's labor, to get at the heart of the issue of how, having a conversation about how it is we value this work, why it's so important. As the CLC, we've done a lot of work to really highlight the importance of the care economy, especially in a context today where our country is facing so much economic uncertainty. And there's this sort of race to address all of the tariff issues that are coming up and the devastating consequences this is happening on our economy and our communities from coast to coast. But what we fail to see is meaningful investments in the sectors that domestically are holding our economy together. Care workers, healthcare workers, childcare workers, folks that do the both paid and unpaid labor that sustains our communities and in turn our economies. These are places where our government needs to be investing, and unions and our labor movement overall has been really proud sort of to highlight. And of course, these are workplaces where over 75% of laborers in the sector are women. And so it's directly tied to when we're talking about the issue of advancing gender equity and gender justice, that we address these injustices that are facing care workers and caregivers, and the importance of the care economy to Canada's domestic economic security. Another piece that I would want to highlight is that when we talk about gender inequities in the modern workplace, however, this I would say has been a longstanding issue, those inequities are not felt the same. And I think what I'm really proud of is to have been part of a labor movement that is recognizing those differences, and putting forward recommendations as well as on the legislative table, at the bargaining table, and in our campaigns work that recognizes the importance of applying that intersectional framework to know that, for example, Black, racialized, Indigenous women and women with disabilities face even larger wage gaps than white women do when we're talking about this issue of pay equity, for example. And so we can't divorce the struggle for pay equity for the struggle, for example, to understanding how systemic discrimination and racism impacts women, racialized women, Black women, Indigenous women, and women with disabilities in the workplace. It's actually women with disabilities that face the largest wage gap at work. And so that's a really important piece for us to also be thinking about in terms of grounding our gender equity analysis in an analysis that propels accessibility and the inclusion of women with disabilities at the forefront as well. And I think another piece about what makes our labor movement so unique in this work, in addressing these inequities in the workplace, is that we have a representative structure that really brings forward those voices as part of how the decision-making is made for our movement. And so at every level, whether it's at our national or triennial conventions that happen every 3 years, workers get together, thousands of workers, to be able to put forward an agenda for political advocacy and lobbying. We have one coming up this May, and that's incredibly exciting because we're setting the agenda for the upcoming 3 years. And beyond that, we have representation on our National Executive Council, as well as in the officers that are elected in our movement to help prioritize and ensure that this work is being led as a core part of the mandate of our labor movement. And so I think that it's really important to think about sort of all the different ways in which we really need to have a multi-pronged approach to addressing some of these long-standing issues in the workplace that have formed these barriers to us achieving gender equity and gender justice at work, but also to be thinking about what are the lessons learned from those experiences that can help us also address and propel forward this sort of theme of gender equity as we face new challenges. So we can think about, for example, the introduction of AI and other similar types of technologies, the ingrained gender inequity biases that continue to exist, whether we're talking about algorithmic bias, the potential sort of impacts on all parts of the employment cycle, from hiring to performance metrics to how workers are classified via algorithms that can really consequentially impact women as well as Black, Indigenous, and racialized and folks with disabilities in the workplace. And then that really reflects, and we see here a really great example, I think, of technology just reflecting back to us the issues the systemic issues that already existed in our communities that were also reflected back in our workplaces. So I'll wrap up because I want to get to our panelists with just offering those thoughts. And I think that there's so much when we talk about sort of advancing gender equity in the modern workplace that we need to ground ourselves in both the history of where we come from, which is why the organization, the Women's History Project, and the work that you folks do is so important to reminding us of that history so that we can come back to solutions in the present that are grounded in what we've learned and that can help us propel forward a vision for justice and equity that reflects that and that meets the moment and meets those new challenges. So I'll leave it there for me today. If you want to learn more about what the CLC is doing, check out our newest campaign. It's called Workers Together. I think a link will be dropped in the chat, workerstogether.ca. And there's an opportunity there for you as well to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay in the loop with what the labor movement is organizing nationally. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to move on to introducing our incredible panelists. And what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce them all, and then we're going to go one by one, and we're going to hear from them about some of the incredible work that they're doing that intersects with our theme today around advancing justice in the workplace and gender equity. So the first speaker that I would like to introduce is Dr. Winnie Neck. Winnie Neck is a labor rights activist and a scholar with a deep commitment to anti-racism, equity, and worker empowerment. She is the former Unifor National Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Toronto Metropolitan University, the first and only union-endowed chair at a Canadian university. And she began her activist work in the labor movement in 1977 as a union organizer with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and later on with here, Local 75. She served as the Ontario Regional Director with the Canadian Labour Congress for 8 years before returning to the Academy to complete her doctoral program at OISE/University of Toronto. Winnie's research focuses on reimagining the labor movement from a decolonizing and anti-racism perspective, and the physical and mental health impact of global labor market restructuring, plant closure, and precarious employment on racialized immigrant and migrant workers, and in particular, women workers. She is the recipient of numerous distinctions, including the Urban Alliance on Race Relations Leadership Award, the United Farm Workers Cesar Chavez Black Eagle Award, and the YWCA Women of Distinction Award. She is a founding member of the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance and Asian Canadian Women's Alliance, and the former co-chair of the Good Jobs for All Coalition. All right. Next, I will introduce Johanne Perron. Johanne has been the executive director of the New Brunswick Coalition for Pay Equity since 2001. She's interested in social justice, in particular women's equality, and she has a BA in International Development Studies from Dalhousie University, as well as a master's degree in environmental studies from the University of Moncton. In her paid and volunteer work, she has been involved with various organizations such as the Regroupement Féministe du Nouveau-Brunswick, Canada World Youth, Oxfam, the Common Front for Social Justice, and the Atlantic Council for International Cooperation. And finally, I will introduce Lorraine McKeon. Lorraine is currently the executive director of nonfiction at HarperCollins Canada. Before joining the team at HCC, she was the deputy editor of Toronto Life magazine, and previously deputy editor of Reader's Digest Canada and the digital editor of The Walrus. Lauren has also been the editor of Canada's progressive, independent This magazine, and has worked as a reporter, editor, and writer in the Arctic, living in Yellowknife and traveling Canada's territories and northern Alberta. Lauren has taught long-form writing at Humber College, and she has a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction from the University of King's College. Her most recent book, Women of the Pandemic, Stories from the Front Lines of COVID-19, was published in April 2021 with McKeon and Stewart. Lorraine is also the author of No More Nice Girls, Gender, Power, and Why It's Time to Stop Playing by the Rules, as well as F-Bomb, Dispatches from the War on Feminism. So I can imagine after hearing all of these wonderful biographies that you're just as excited as I am to be jumping into this conversation. So I'm actually going to throw it first to you, Lorraine, to tell us more about how the work that you're doing is intersecting with today's theme. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for telling us more about the CLC to kick off. It was such a powerful way to set the stage for this conversation. So hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here today to join you in the audience and my fellow panelists today to talk about women work in activism. And, as a journalist and a nonfiction author, I want to examine the world around me, but, often through a not so rosy feminist lens. And as you just heard, my work has focused on the rise of anti-feminism and the manosphere. It has focused on ideas of gender, power, leadership, and equity. And most recently, women and the COVID-19 pandemic, how women led through the pandemic, how they lost through the pandemic, and how they tried to really build a blueprint for a different future. My next book is looking at sexual violence. So, also carrying through those themes. And I've also written, in my own work about my personal experiences with sexual and domestic violence. As a nonfiction editor of magazines and now books, I've also spent a lot of my career championing underrepresented, underreported voices and stories. So I do truly believe, as you will learn, that stories have the power to connect us and to inspire us and to spark discussion and conversation. And maybe it's a bit idealistic, but I believe that in sharing our stories, we also do have the power to change the world. So while I am not an academic, I do hope to share today what I've learned from speaking with hundreds of diverse women from across the country about their lived experiences. And I also look forward to learning from my fellow panelists as well. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lorraine. I really loved what you said about, I had to write it down, women who have led, lost, and are now building a blueprint for a different future. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciated it. All right, we'll continue with you, Johanne. So go ahead. Over to you.
Okay. Well, I guess I should specify that most of my work has been with the Coalition for Pay Equity. It's been 25 years now. So yeah, and we started this work like I'm as old as my organization, more or less, and we've been trying to bring about systemic change and move away from asking women to change all the time and put all the burden of improving things on women's shoulders by changing the legal system in some ways. And we wanted to have something specific. We didn't want to, well, we believe in many changes, but we felt that pushing for pay equity legislation would be very important because it was linked to the value of women's work. We've focused on that with a human rights perspective quite a bit. But I really like what you said, Bilan. We also need to change our culture. So we've been working at that level as well, doing a lot of education. It seems like we repeat the same message over and over again, but I do feel that things are changing in our little part of the world in New Brunswick. I remember meeting MLAs who would tell us, well, if we pay women more, we will all pay our apples more. And we don't hear that kind of feedback anymore. With time, we got pay equity legislation for the public sector in New Brunswick, but we don't have legislation for the private sector. We have promises that it will come. We are also working on pay transparency now. There's legislation that was introduced at the Legislative Assembly just recently, not passed yet, but on its way to get passed. And the reason we got involved in pay transparency is that we realized that often we didn't even have pay parity. We didn't know. We have it's the law. You have the Human Rights Act that says that we should get the same pay as regardless of gender or race or your sexual orientation or all the different aspects of identity. But if you don't know what your colleagues are making, how can you tell? So we started working on pay transparency as well for the past few years. And so I'm like Lauren, and I'm sure Winnie is. I'm looking forward to continue the conversation with the panelists and you, Bilan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Johanne, for that really great overview. And I really like what you said, especially at the end about sort of connecting the issue of pay inequities to human rights, but understanding that sort of more broadly. I think it really gets to recognizing the interconnectedness of these struggles, the fact that they don't impact us all the same way. I think that sort of flows well to your work, Winnie, in terms of understanding through a decolonial perspective how we can advance on some of these really critical issues around gender inequities. So I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to begin by sharing the realities of 3 women workers. And it grounds me in terms of how we move forward on fighting for equality. Right now, there's a woman worker who is scheduled, who works on night shift because she hasn't got enough seniority to move up. She's a single parent with a young daughter. She's now paying $25 an hour to have a caregiver that would watch over her daughter, her young daughter, at the midnight shift. And one can imagine how much money pay that she can take home. The other is a group of women cleaners, housekeeping staff in the hospitality sector who are made to clean men's washroom alone without a phone and without any security protections. Then the other is a racialized woman worker who has been suspended from work because her work permit has expired. And due to the backlog of IRCC, she is now ending up having to wait at least 9 months to get her work permit. And to me, these are the intersectional issues when against the backdrops of wars and trade wars, we now have political and economic systems that's propped up by capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. These three-legged pillars prop up the system, and the women experiences that we talk about are bearing the brunt of this this reality with stagnant wages and rising costs of living. So to me, I think part of the necessity, the need in terms of our organizing is saying, yes, we need pay equity. But for a lot of women from the equity deserving groups, i.e. racialized women, refugee women, newcomers, women with disability, indigenous women, we need to get a foot in the door. So in that sense, pay equity and employment equity needs to go hand in hand. It's not one over the other, right? And the other piece is, part of the resistance need to come from our labor movement, taking a much more proactive, or I would say even more intense and aggressive organizing strategies to reach out to the workers who are non-unionized. How could we have 1/3, only 1/3 of the workforce in Canada unionized, and we are leaving so many workers who are in precarious employment behind. Right now, from a study that I did with Jim Stanford for the Center for Future of Work, unionizations from 2022, unionization rate for racialized workers, the rate is at 25% compared to 33% among the non-racialized workers. So there is a gap here. And with the demographic shift, more needs to be done. And in that sense, also the intersectional wage gaps, when you compare racialized women's wages overall with non-racialized men's wages, the gap is over 22%. And these, to me, I think, as much as things have moved forward and advanced, it feels like, in the rise against the backdrop of the far-right agenda and the right-wing populisms, the equity agenda are being pushed backward, and so many different institutions are now paying lip service rather than moving with their concrete commitments. And so that to me, are coupling with the vulnerability and marginalizations within the labor market. We are seeing, workers being pushed back, and particularly workers from the diverse communities are being kept on a short leash and being kept silent. And I think part of our challenge right now within the labor movement and in the community is, how do we break that chain? How do we create the space, or create that sense that we can claim the space and shake the trees and feel empowered to make the change we want to see in the community? So. That's I don't know whether my 4 minutes is up, but
You were almost right on time. Thank you so much, Winnie, and so many quotable moments from everyone. But I'm just sort of curiously taking these notes too, like when you said so much of sort of these vulnerabilities are happening against the backdrop of wars and trade wars, and we have these systems of inequity that are popped up, like capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy. I especially liked what you said at the end about claiming space and shaking the trees. I just, something about that imagery of like, because when you shake a tree, you have all this like leaves that fall and foliage, and it almost feels like it's the opportunities, right? Like it's the things that maybe weren't clear at first glance that we start to see falling within reach, and we can start to gather that. And of course, the more
that's what we do as activists. We are good troublemakers.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, thank you so much, Winnie. Thank you all for your introductory remarks. We're going to get it more into just a discussion, and I'm going to throw some questions out there. I'll try to direct them at folks, especially at the beginning. But if you're also interested in piping in any of the other panelists that maybe I don't direct it to, please feel free. And I think we can have a bit more of an organic discussion in that way. So I wanted to ask this question particularly to you, Johanne, because you were talking about some of the sort of struggles with pursuing pay equity within the private sector. And so I wondered if you could maybe sort of speak to why highlighting, where women are treated differently in different sectors, that we can't just take those victories in the public sector for granted, and what it means when you say there's promises for action, but there's still that need to continue to advocate.
Yeah. Well, there is certainly more resistance from employers in the private sector, and I wish they would see pay equity, pay parity, employment equity, pay transparency as good human resource management tools, and that they would feel like, well, it's human rights, and I really have to commit to it. That's unfortunately not the way it is. I wouldn't say that employers are necessarily coming at it from a negative perspective, or that they want to really push some groups down, but certainly they don't like to be told what to do. At the same time, well, we always said that they had the opportunity to make changes on a voluntary basis for years, for decades, for centuries, and it's not happening. So we do need legislation to change things. Yeah, so that's how I feel. I should mention quickly what is pay equity, though. We're talking about it, but it's not always well understood. So when we talk about pay parity, we're talking about equal pay for equal work, and people understand that quite well. But when we're talking about pay equity, we're comparing jobs where you have mostly women and jobs where you have mostly men. And if they have the same value, then they should have the same pay. That would be pay equity. The reality is that jobs where you have mostly women are often jobs that are undervalued, underpaid. And with COVID, we could see that particularly clearly with all the focus that we finally put on caregiving. It didn't lead, it led to better wages, but certainly not to pay equity, though. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. And we often see that people from different equity-seeking groups, and if you take an intersectional approach, you see that women, racialized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities tend to be in those women-dominated jobs that are underpaid, and they're pushed more and more there, and also racialized men, as a matter of fact. So it's a reality, and well, we need to make those changes, I guess.
We do, absolutely. And I just want to really highlight what you're speaking to in terms of, really emphasizing the importance of that enforceability and those mechanisms, because then it offers us as advocates with a pathway to be able to affect change and to hold employers as well as institutions and governments accountable for some of those inequities that are happening. But you're absolutely right as well. It needs to be tied in with a real recognition of what's happening culturally too, and how pay equity is defined. I really appreciate that you added that. Winnie, did you want to add something to the conversation? Oh, you're just muted, so we'll need you to unmute.
Sorry. Just echoing what Johanne has been saying about sometimes, pay equity has been misunderstood as equal pay for work of equal value, right? And so when even back in the 70s, 80s, when I was a union organizer in the garment factory, it's what are for sewing machine operators who are predominantly women, what are the comparables? Are they the cutters, the pressers within the plant? That wasn't even part of the conversations. Equally, employment equity, the concept has also been so misconstrued and misunderstood. It's reverse. I mean, the dominant narrative it's reverse discriminations. You are just hiring all these equity deserving groups with, blindly, quote unquote. And so I think part of that, it's not just dispelling the myth, but also, it's also, having a much clearer understanding that how can we compete when we are not at the equal footing or level playing field, right? And if you take a look at within the women in the workforce, particularly women are not, and in particular racialized women, indigenous women, are not readily present in highly unionized sector like constructions, higher educations, and government services. And then my worry is right now with the federal government's cuts in spending and cuts in staffing, the ones who have been more it would be the women workers, particularly, women workers from the marginalized groups, getting the brunt of it because they have less seniority and they can't bump someone else to hold on to their job security. And I think it's a rippling effect when we don't address the issues of pay and access and, and success in retention in the workplace. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. These struggles are interconnected, and I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I think that it's a big piece of how our advocacy has evolved, right? Like, I think if we want to think about where we've been and where we're going, I think that there is a much clearer interconnection when we're talking about, pay equity. We can't divorce that from also talking about employment equity, from talking about accessibility and talking about how all of these issues sort of interconnect in terms of really radically addressing those systemic barriers. So it's not just a Band-Aid solution, but we're starting to sort of ensure that we're actually reframing our approach to be a more comprehensive and intersectional one. So I really appreciate sort of the emphasis on that. And again, the emphasis on when we're talking about pay equity, we're talking about value. And I think that comes back to the cultural piece too. So Lauren, I'd like to go to you next, because I think this lends itself well to, when we're thinking about how we're able to communicate some of these advancements, reflecting back on the history that we have had as well. But what do you think of, the particular role that perhaps storytelling plays in helping us learn from our experiences, but continue to advance this work of gender equity in the modern workplace?
Yeah, I think it's so important that we're able to put women's experiences to words and to records, because as we know, we haven't historically done that. And even, when we were looking at women of the pandemic, one of the reasons that I was drawn to write about the first year of women's experiences during the pandemic was it was, one of the first big moments in our history where it really was women leading the story, women telling the story, women most affected. And so many times when we look at these big significant events throughout history, women are, relegated to sisters, wives, the footnotes of the story. And, this was our story. And I think that, it was also very much a story of women's labor in a huge way, women's leadership, how our ideas of what leadership was and what was important in a leader shifted, and, how women lost so much during the pandemic, but also how they lifted us up so much. So there was so much to catalog. And I think, especially when it comes to the pandemic, where we've sort of seen so much blueprint for change, and we saw so many things happen that we were told never that would never happen. Like things like close to universal basic income. We saw, things like that come into play. We saw people and industries, that were told that, you could never get a raise, suddenly were, they were getting more. But I think, what we also did is and I remember talking to women who were at the head of that change at that time saying, we've seen what's possible. And we've seen sort of a total breakdown in society. And now we're trying to build back up. But their biggest fear was that we would forget that we could do it. We would forget what we had experienced, and we would forget what's possible because we've seen that. And we have kind of seen that in a way. People don't like to talk about the pandemic. A lot of those radical solutions that were put forward and a lot of very progressive solutions that were put forward and this value on equity that was put forward has sort of fallen again from the popular conversation. So I think that, it's important that we have those stories and we record that history. So not only that we don't forget, I mean, we've also seen that there's a huge backlash. So it's not, like we're just forgetting and like, oh no, we suddenly forgot it. There's forces right now, especially, but also anytime that we see women progress forward in history, that backlash, that try and erase those stories, that try and erase that progress. So I think that, and that try and just erase women's voices. So I think that we need to be loud and we need to share our stories and we need to share our experiences so that we can connect to each other, but also so that we can begin to make change when we share those stories. Because I think there's, nothing more powerful in a lot of ways than being loud and sharing your story when people just kind of want you to shut up. So.
Absolutely. And I think for many of us, we can probably think of, one or more stories of defiant women who helped launch our own activism, whether it was, ones that we witnessed, ones that we read about. I think the inspiration is certainly there. And particularly when we talk about, I love that you sort of brought in backlash, because I would like to talk about that more and some of the barriers that we're facing. But I think that, when we consider what's been happening even globally with the rise of the anti-rights movement, the Canadian Labour Congress, just tell you a little bit more about our work internationally. We're part of a global labor movement, of course, and that sort of underscores the importance of workers' struggle and solidarity around the world. And a big part of that I was recently able to be a part of was our involvement at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, where we have a large labor delegation, and we're talking about, the theme this year for the CSW was around access to justice for women and girls. And so we talked about the importance of accessing justice through collective organizing and bargaining, and what that meant and the difference that has made for women to have access to the right to participate in the union and the rights to organize, to bargain collectively and to strike. And the rights the rights framework that creates more access to justice, both in the workplace and in the community. But it was really telling to see sort of the ways in which, particularly year over year, those anti-rights movements have grown louder and louder. And it's certainly clear that they are sort of drafting and putting together their own narratives for what it means to be advancing women's rights, so-called women rights in their perspective, but rewriting that to really set us back in terms of the gains that we've made socially and economically over the last few decades. And so it's quite frightening to see actually the advancement of those conversations. And of course, it's not isolated to international spaces. We see them at home. We see them in our communities. We see them sometimes in our workplaces too. And so it's important that we're thinking about how we address this and how much it's impacting our work to advance women's rights and gender equity at work. So since you talked about some of these forces already, Winnie, I wanted to throw it back to you. You named so many of them broadly, but could you speak more specifically about how these forces, the rise of far-right governments and politicians, sort of these issues around sort of the propping up of systems of discrimination around capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, how is this affecting women's inequity issues and advancement in the workplace from your perspective?
Yeah, just building on what Lauren had said about the backlash. And to me, I think that backlash has also have been emboldened by the lack of political leadership willing to stand up and speak out and say this is not on, right? So, whatever happening in south of the border, it's a virus that's gone around the world. And in the workplaces, I mean, the realities that I listed earlier, this is right now what's happening. But I guess I'm sort of also recognizing that, there is the need earlier talking about, being loud. And I think what we're also seeing is, the history of our struggles, of our resistance have also been, quote unquote, erased or neglected and not being remembered. And in workplaces, as the organizing, it's, sorry if I can, let me just reiterate, in organizing workplaces, because of all the vulnerabilities and the insecurity, workers are much more reticent, right? If I keep my head down, maybe the next blow won't come to me. And I think part of our challenge as labor activists or social movement activists, it's saying, if we don't speak up, if we don't stand up, then when it comes to me, then there's nobody around to support each other. So I think what we need to do, and I'm hoping that, through at the CLC convention, there'll be a real proactive call for actions. Right now, I believe it's a wake-up call for all workers, for the labor movement. It's how do we make sure we close the gap on gender, but also close the gaps between unionized workers and non-unionized workers? How can we make sure trade unions as organizations would go out and organize, organize from smaller workplaces to large workplaces and invest that resources and reach out to the diverse communities, the members who speak various languages, the members to reach out to workers with disabilities. And I think the next round, when the layoffs, when the restructuring comes, and then earlier you mentioned about the AI, my concern is the AI is going to be really restructuring how our labor market it's at the current labor market. So, I mean, I would add on, Laura talk about being loud, and I'm saying we need to be bold as well. Loud, bold, and creative, and intensifies. Just do it before before it's too late.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yeah,
if I'm sounding really alarmist, I sense the urgency, and I don't see the reciprocal urgent responses and proactive responses from our part. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the urgency is very welcome in this space, because I think that it really underscores the critical importance of these conversations, these calls to action. Exactly what you said about being bold and being loud. Like, we need those strategies, and we need to address the multiple intersecting crises that we are facing. So I think it's a really important reflection on the moment and the scale of response that's necessary to respond to that. Thank you for sharing that, Winnie. And I want to go to you, Johanne, because I'm wondering, like, what has this looked like from your perspective in terms of the work that you're doing to try to advance pay equity in New Brunswick? But even if you wanted to reflect larger than that, like, how do you think this backlash, this anti-rights movement that we see sort of taking hold of politics from coast to coast, and in fact around the world, how has that impacted your work and your advocacy with your organization?
It's well, in New Brunswick, it might be a little different. Like I don't feel it as strongly. I find it's in a broader space that it's happening. I feel like we are, well, we have waves, I suppose. At this point, we don't have. We had a wave of rights being questioned a little more in New Brunswick, but right now people push back, and it feels like we're in a place where things are moving forward, actually, which is really weird because it's different from elsewhere. Like we have pay equity, I was saying pay transparency legislation that is at the Legislative Assembly. We have pay equity legislation promised for the private sector coming up in a year, supposedly. I know there will be pushback, but it's still in the books from our government. So it depends a lot. So hopefully we will be bold and loud enough to keep that going forward. Can I build on something that Winnie said, though?
Yeah.
Because I really liked how you pushed for unionization. One of the reasons it's so hard to move towards pay equity or employment equity in the private sector, I think, is that there's very few people who are unionized in the private sector now,
Yeah.
actually.
Yes.
And many people work in small organizations where it's really hard to unionize. And that's why I feel the need for legislation. But even so, without unionization, sometimes you have great legislation, but it's hard to implement. So it's a very challenging point. I don't have a solution. I know it's hard to organize. We organize around organizations instead of around unions sometimes, especially for the smaller employers or people working for smaller employers. But it also struck me how the stories of the women and people from different equity-seeking groups working in those small organizations are not heard in actual fact, right? It's often other people who bring it forward, like Winnie did at the beginning of her talk earlier, like we do in our own work. But it's that's where inequality shows. You don't even tell your own story sometimes, right?
Absolutely. It's those voices that are missing. Did you want to jump in on this, Winnie?
Yeah, this as responding to what Johanne is saying, you're so right. That's in a way the 33% of our unionized workforce actually is propped up by this strong organizing and unionizations within the public sector, which actually it's a tribute to the women workers in the public sector. And in Ontario, as far as we know, it's the unionization rate within the private sector, it's only around 17%. And so it's a very disturbing trend, and that's why, and then particularly you take into account the rise of gig economy, the workers in precarious employment, the young workers who graduate from post-secondary education and just doing the gig work. And in that sense, it's sort of precarious employment and precarious status leads to precarity of everything. And people become so preoccupied with their own survival that everything else becomes secondary. So that's why, there's an urgency for our labor movement. But at the same time, I don't want to leave a negative note here. We are seeing, young workers from Starbucks, from Amazon, from different workplaces that are coming together and organize. And to me, I think this is where, when workers are so enraged, they rise up and resist. And to me, that's the power of collective actions, right? And the organizing becomes that the grounding for what other actions, what other changes that workers need to see. And if I sound like a broken record, I'm saying labor movement within our communities, within labor movement, there needs to be a whole lot more massive organizing campaign that goes on.
I think it's a broken record we're all willing to re-listen to. So thank you for it, Winnie. And I think we have a little bit more time together, so we're going to get more into sort of the forward-thinking, hopeful piece. So don't worry, we are also going to be thinking about that together. But before we move on too far, Lorraine, I wanted to throw it back to you because you were the one that really helped us introduce this topic around the backlash. But where do you see it in your world? Like, where do you think it's the most pronounced, and how do you feel maybe witnessed or seen that it's impacting women's equity issues in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, in my work, in interviewing other people and speaking to other people. So my first book, I remember taking it out, to shop around to try and find a publisher. And it was about this backlash, or the bubbling resurgence of this backlash. And it was before Trump was elected the first time. And I remember taking it out and, hearing from a lot of people being like, what are you talking about? Like, Hillary Clinton is going to be president. You're just like raising an alarm that doesn't exist. And, this is not actually happening. We're in the most progressive time that we've ever been in. And I think, obviously that did not come to pass, but I think, part of that reaction is that a lot of people in privileged positions, don't pay attention to the backlash. They don't pay attention to what's happening, bubbling under the surface. They don't, they think that everything is fine. And this sort of, the tokenism that we see sort of at that time, the very commercialization of feminism really gave this perception that things had changed in a bigger way than they have, but also that, it was impenetrable, that that no backlash was going to come through. And, that we know that's not true. And we also know that at that time and now, even without the backlash, which is really, we're seeing the effects, we're seeing it affect the political will, we're seeing it affect popular conversation where people are saying haven't you got enough? Isn't everything fine? So I think, we're seeing that backlash everywhere with, and we're seeing it where, we know that having one maybe woman at the top who's a CEO or one public facing person is not enough to change a company culture. It doesn't trickle down. We know that. Studies have shown that. But, we're seeing this kind of, don't you have enough already? Haven't you pushed it far enough already? And we know that that's not true. We know that, as we've talked here, as we've seen. So I think that backlash, I didn't quite answer your question because I think the answer is everywhere. We're seeing it everywhere, and we have been seeing it everywhere. And I don't think, there's anywhere that it doesn't exist. And I think, where we're starting to see it more and more is certainly, I think, and part of the reason we missed it, or, that certain people missed it so long ago, is because we weren't looking online. We weren't paying attention to those conversations and the discourse that was happening online that young people were, buying into. And now we're seeing that online discourse is real. Of course it is, but that that the messaging is real, the beliefs are real, and we're seeing how it permeates into workplaces, but feeds back in. We're seeing our youth grow up with ideas about equity and women's work and all of that. So I think, we're seeing it everywhere, but we're also seeing, again, not to like, as we said, not to get too negative, we're also seeing the pushback. We are seeing women become bold, and we are seeing women speak out, and we are seeing, as we have always seen, women fight back. And I think, we're also starting to do that in a way that is intersectional, and that is starting, and it is elevating more voices and starting to tackle privilege in a way that maybe we haven't seen in the movement in a while. We still have a long way to go, but I think that, we're starting to really rise up against that backlash in a way that is encouraging as well.
Absolutely. And I think like it really highlights, I think, the importance of that historical, like going back to where we've been to be able to map forward where we want to go. And just like theorizing that as almost like a sort of a critical foundation for our organizing structures. It goes back to what Winnie was saying about like recognizing the importance of organizing as part of pushing back, the importance of culture shift as part is pushing back, and then the importance of storytelling. And so I think that those are all sort of interconnected and help us really address how we can mount the scale of pushback that is necessary, but that isn't only about responding to, but also imagining futures that aren't just on the defense. I think that we can proactively also be imagining futures where gender equity is a reality. And so maybe in the spirit of that and moving more towards that hopeful discussion, let's talk about, what are the good news stories? What's happening in your world, where you're organizing, where you're advocating, that is inspiring you, that is keeping you uplifted and motivated, and seeing that, real change is possible. So I'll turn it over to you, maybe Johanne, to kick us off, and then we'll give space to everyone else as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that we remain careful about what's going on in terms of backlash, because yes, we hear those negative discussions, but we're in a better place right now. It happens like that in our small province here. One of the things that encourages me is the fact that wages in the caregiving sector have gone up quite a bit since like in the past 25 years. Used to be very much almost minimum wage. It's not huge still, not enough, but I see a movement to recognize the value of that work, which we hadn't seen before. Childcare too. I am worried though. I think it all depends on the willingness of people, of the public, of the government to invest in those wages. That's one thing. So yeah, that's something that gives me hope. I find young women are very much aware of the importance of having an intersectional approach, and bring that forward quite a bit. Yeah, those are the first things that come to my mind. I'd like to hear others, and maybe other things will come up after. But
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Lauren? Like, we're just sort of coming off of that conversation around backlash. I'm curious about what are the good news stories in your world that are keeping you motivated?
Yeah, I know after when I was touring my first book that was on that backlash, um, a lot of women were like, okay, but tell me a good news story. Like, tell me something that will make me feel good about where we're going. And, that was really what I endeavored to do in my second book, which is No More Nice Girls, because I think there are so many incredible stories of people that are doing power differently, that are pushing back against this, that are leaving the system, right? That are saying, if I can't make it work in the system, what can I create outside of the system? What would a new future or a different future look like? And, speaking to women that are making, art, that are telling different stories and challenging different stories. We can look to, artists, I think, to find different futures, and to find people exploring different futures, like film physical media, all of that sort of stuff. But then also, speaking to women that are doing, founding their own companies and structuring them differently in ways that we haven't seen, and valuing collaboration and, kindness, and doing things that, seem as simple but aren't as like, you have a bad period day, you don't have to hide it and we can talk about it, and you can have a sick day and that's fine and you won't be punished. Like, that's actually quite huge when we think about company culture. So things like that. And, I remember speaking to one woman who was a tech developer, and she developed an AI bot called Ladybot. And so what it did was it looked at things like Reddit and 4chan and things like that. And it like sort of trolled the websites. And if it found anything that was misogynistic, it would respond with like a famous feminist quote, which was just like a lovely and delightful way, so that she didn't have to argue with them, but this would just go and like leave it, all the way through. So I think, and there are so many women out there that are looking at ways that the system doesn't work for them in ways big and small, and, making differences. I spoke to another woman that had started a greeting card company because she had noticed that, not only were like all the Hallmark cards, did they show a very specific kind of women, so it was a diversity of women, but also she started making cards like, happy divorce, happy congratulations on leaving your abusive relationship, happy to yourself day, and, things like that, and she has like, it was popular, right? She's making a living doing it. So I think that those stories of people just on scales, I think people often feel defeated because they're like, what could I do that could possibly make a difference? But there are so many things that you can do, even if it seems small, that I think do make a difference and do start to shift what we believe is possible, and, that support other people. So I think there's a lot going on that is actually very positive amidst all of this.
Absolutely. And I think it's so powerful as part of that sort of mantra of being bold and being loud, but being loud about our positive, creative stories that are sort of reimagining what's possible. And I think that there's just so much joy even seeing the reactions from the stories that you were just sharing now, pouring in, a laugh emoji, a heart emoji. It's clear that it resonates. And I think it's that hopefulness that that keeps us inspired in the work that we do, that we're not working from a point of scarcity, but from an abundance of hope, that we can dream of a better future collectively, and we can create that through our work together. And it can be fun at the same time. Winnie, what about you? I know you started us off earlier, even talking about Starbucks and, leaning into it. Like, tell us more about some of those good news stories.
Yes, and I think it's in a way, organizing and community rising, it's a project of hopefulness to overcome cynicism, isolations, and all the apathy, or just, people feeling that they are powerless, right? And so aside from the Starbucks organizing, the Amazons, we in the recent years, we have also seen the gig economy workers, particularly Fedora, who end up forming, organizing, and right now in Toronto or in Ontario, under the service arrangement of Canadian Union of Postal Workers, there's a gig workers union. They are comprised of young workers. The leadership, it's diverse, and it's those initiatives. And then at the same time, we're also seeing a much more authentic labor community coalition building. In Ontario, particularly with some of the teachers union, like the secondary OSSTF, has, during the crisis, the anti-Black racism, George Floyd crisis, murder of George Floyd, the rise of that movement, is teachers went out into the community and start organizing with their students youth leadership network, or you have, right now the elementary teachers are now, teachers are well respected in the community. It's a link with the parents, and they're using that stewardship, that role in building, a stronger community resistance against what Ford government is trying to do in cutting education funding, cutting teachers. And the same goes, then you also see students, college students, university students protesting in front of Queen's Park against the OSAP cut. These, to me, I think they are the markers, and those are organizing moments. And then last but not the least, it's every day we see new members standing up to the bosses and saying, no, I'm not going to take this anymore. And they initiate a grievance process. And to me, those are powerful moments, and when workers feel empowered. And then last but not the least, is you have different unions now moving into women in leadership training programs, mentorship program. These are ways in making sure that the emerging activists, the emerging leaders would be the leaders that we've been waiting for. And that those are, to me, that's a successional planning. And in a sense, we all walk on the shoulders of those who come before us. And there's so much incumbent upon all of us to crack the space, open even wider, and do clear cutting for the path for those who come after us. Yeah.
Absolutely. I've heard a variation of that exact statement, like we stand on the shoulder of giants. And I think about that, both personally, I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and it was built off of the shoulders of my mother's sacrifices and her mother's sacrifices and so on. And so we see it in our sort of intimate lives. And then we see it professionally as well, in terms of, even being able to be part of a specific human rights department as part of our labor movement. I know you, Winnie, in particular, would know so much of the history of that at the CLC and in labor. And so I think that that feeling of standing on the shoulder of giants and then just cracking it wide open is so important. And I think it's a hopeful piece that helps, hopefully will help to continue to propel our activism, so that these are not new floors that we are creating or ceilings for, these are not new ceilings that we are putting forward, but floors for us to be able to rise up even higher from. So something that we haven't talked about, and I just want to invite somebody who's already been greatly active in the chat, which is awesome. I want to invite Linda Silver-John to just join the conversation quickly and bring in the topic around harassment and violence, in particular in the workplace, and a really exciting project that you're working on that. So go ahead, Linda.
Okay. Well, what it is that I guess I didn't see enough about feminism in the public arena, and I didn't see enough happening to encourage young people to work toward that. And it occurred to me that I should do something about it. Anyway, this is a series of 5 conversations with older and younger feminists with various points of view, in which we take stock of the status of our activism for equality and social justice, and look at the vigilance and sisterhood that's required in order to advance it. The first 2, one is on violence against women, the second is on reproductive rights, but the third really fits in, and that's just recently released with what we're talking about here, because that's workplace harassment is the theme. And a different perspective than I'm hearing here, that has 2 lawyers on it, and being a lawyer myself, I do look at things from a legal perspective to say, how can the law help? First, you need a law, and then you need a public push to implement the law and enforce the law and make sure that it works. And then you've got to go to court and make sure the judges interpret it properly. So the work never ends. Anyway, Danielle Bisnar at Cavaluso and Janice Rubin, who's involved in workplace investigations, are in conversation with me about whether the existing legal tools are enough to protect workers, or whether we need increased funding, increased staffing. We look at what kind of systemic, and one of you mentioned the word systemic, and to me, it's the most important word in the feminist movement, because too many women think whatever's happening to them is their fault, rather than something that's part of a systemic way in which society works. And it's so important to deal with that. We talk about how to help marginalized and vulnerable workers, cyberbullying, intersectional issues, the employer's responsibility, and alternate strategies such as the Occupational Health and Safety Act. I have to say, when you talk to Winnie about the labor movement, it's actually not in that session. The session after that, that's going to be released in the next week or so, has Mary Cornish and Constance Backhouse. Mary Cornish founded the Equal Pay Coalition. Johanne will know that, in Ontario. And so we had, in the 4th episode, very interesting conversation on pay equity in childcare, because that's so important in how women are able to live in the workplace. Anyway, she gave a huge amount of credit to the labor movement for enabling the work of the Equal Pay Coalition in her talking about it. And one of the things that came out in that on pay equity was, what is the number? Because I read 88% and then I read 68%. And I said, Mary, when the Ontario law was passed in 1986, it was 63 cents. Women were earning 63 cents on the dollar that every man earned. And they say it's 88 cents. But the Equal Pay Coalition, which I trust more, says 68 cents. And she said it's because they like to use that 88 number because it talks about hourly rate. But people earning an hourly rate normally are part-time workers for all kinds of reasons, and they're not. We compare average annual earnings, and what was 63 cents on the dollar 40 years ago is now 68 cents on the dollar. We've only advanced 4 cents on the dollar. We've got laws, we've got a pay equity commission, but governments like Harris have taken away some money, some funding, some staffing, and taken away. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time, except I hope that you'll watch some of these. I put the link, fairlyequalseries.com in the chat. And the one after that, by the way, the 5th one will be on women in politics. We have 2 female members of parliament, and I gave them the job of making sure that I spoke to Karina Gould, and I said to her, just make sure that all these emphasis on the economy doesn't cut money for women's issues. She said, I'm chairman of the finance committee. So I said, say no more. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for highlighting that excellent work and for sharing all of those links in the chat. And I do want to encourage folks to check that out. We have less than 10 minutes left. And so what I want to do is give each of our panelists an opportunity to very quickly just share any closing thoughts that you have with our audience today. It could be something that maybe we didn't get a chance to get to in our conversation, or just a last word you want to leave folks with. And so I'll go in the opposite order that I started it. So I'll go to you first, Winnie. You're still muted, Winnie, just so you know.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the sessions and the conversations. I guess to me, I think leadership is key. Leadership, having that political courage and the will to change things, right? Rather than just settling. And I think given this current political and economic climates, it's so much easier just to settle. And a lot of times for women, it's settling for the crumbs rather than the big piece of pie. And so it's in that sense, I'm saying we need bold leadership, we need loud leadership, and then at the same time, it's we need to create opportunities where people can come together in person to build that, to meet from the heart rather than just going through meetings with the agenda. And you can't do that with the apps and all the other technologies. So I guess I'm, and it's so much more challenging now with the COVID after the pandemic. So in that sense, it's how do we, and maybe that's a follow-up conversation with Lauren. It's how do we encourage people to do oral history, oral stories, or narratives? How do we amass a collections of frontline workers, women workers' stories to counter the dominant narrative that that it's grounded on patriarchy and white supremacy. And so in that sense, it's using whatever opportunities we have to crack the space, to tackle, to let it, shaking the trees, meaning all the leaves are going to fall, not all at the same time, but there'll be a season where they would fall. And then in the spring, there will be new buds and new leaves. So how do we make sure we sustain our organizing, sustain our spirit of solidarity, so we'll be there when spring comes? Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that symbolism. Thank you so much for that, Winnie. And thank you for all of your remarks today. Johanne?
Yeah, I just believe in organizing and getting together, working together to change things, and recognizing that it's never going to be over. It's just a reality, and I guess we all do it because we believe in it. We have to be true to our values, and reflecting together is also so helpful and powerful, really. You need to work with others. So to me, being part of an organization has always been a way to sustain, I suppose, my activism and my hope for better.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Johanne. We absolutely need those collectivities, and we need one another, because I think it's such a big part of the way that the labor movement organizes to the ethos of strength in numbers, because we can be bold and loud, but if we're doing it alone, we're easier to just ignore and move away. But if we're all doing it together, then we see those systemic sort of waves of change, and it makes a really big difference. Thank you so much for your participation today, Johanne. Lauren?
Yeah, I think I definitely want to echo the importance of collaboration and community, because I think, and we've touched on this a little bit earlier, that it can often feel isolating when you're facing discrimination, harassment, and you do feel like you're the only one. And I think, the system is designed to make us feel like that. But the more that we can collaborate, the more that we can build community, and the more that we can share stories and, think about whose stories we're elevating and whose voices we're listening to, and who we do need to hear more from, and how we can elevate the platforms. I think that, the more powerful we will all become, and our movements will become. And I think that, what you can do is also read outside of your own experiences, learn more about other women's experiences, and elevate and share those stories. And I think that that will help us build those communities that we're seeking.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. And I know that Deborah, speaking of reading about those things, has been posting all of your books for us, as well as other really great resources. So there's already a bit of a book list started for you in the chat, and resource list to dive into. And I hope many of you take advantage of that. Well, before I pass it back to Amy, I just want to say one last thank you to Winnie, Johanne, and Lauren. It's been excellent to be able to be part of this conversation with you. I think we've been able to really dig in as much as we can, but we could talk about this forever. But in the time that we've had to dig into what it takes truly, I think, to be building up an agenda of solidarity, strength, and action towards addressing women's inequity issues in the modern workplace. I think we've highlighted where we've come from, and so much of where we need to go still. And I love the sort of symbiotic piece of that relationship. I think it really highlights the importance of our continued conversation and dialogue around this. And I think especially the imagery of the tree and the seasons, that's going to be changing with sitting with me. And I think that I'm really thankful for all the fruitfulness to continue that maybe of the discussion that we've had today. So thank you very much. And thank you so much to the Women's History Project for inviting me to moderate this discussion. It's been an honor. I will turn it back over to you, Amy, to close us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilan, for moderating.
Thank you so much. What an excellent discussion. I found that Bilan and I were captivated by some of the same quotes from our panelists. Lorraine, you spoke about the women who lived, led, and lost and are writing the blueprint for a better future, and that really inspired me. And then Winnie, when you mentioned capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, which are on the rise, and then how you explained the intersectional wage gap within all, it was really inspired. And Johanne, you also had many moments. At one point you said young women are more aware of taking an intersectional approach. And I was like, oh, that's fantastic. So I really appreciated our entire panel. Thank you. Before we close, I want to share that our next event will take place on Thursday, May 7th at 4:30, same time. The session is Beyond the Glass Ceiling, Designing Tomorrow's Workplaces. And Judy Rebick will be one of our featured panelists. You can find the registered link in the chat. I think Deborah posted it earlier. In closing, I want to extend a very heartfelt thank you to Bilan for moderating and really asking some truly fascinating questions. Winnie, Lorraine, and Johanne, thank you for your insights, your leadership, and your candor. And thank you to our volunteer board and to Deborah, our president, to Ellen, who coordinates our events, and to Tiff Frost, who manages our social media and provides technical support. Thank you all again for being here. Have a good night.